The second biggest bank failure in American history is now just days behind us, and I thought it was important to share some updated tips on diversification and optionality to make sure you keep your wealth. I was contacted by a gentleman who used to work at Goldman Sachs. He's a professional investor, Andrew Uzmov, and he talks about diversification and optionality in a way that I think is very important now when you're seeing, just days ago, people had millions, even tens of millions, in the case of the stablecoin USDC, apparently billions of dollars in one bank. 15 years ago, you wouldn't have done that perhaps. You would have said, oh my goodness, these banks are in terrible shape. I'm going to take my money where it's treated best. But time heals all wounds. People forgot about that. They went back to putting all their money in one pot. Didn't watch the pot very often in some cases, figured, hey, the US government, regulations, and just the go, go, go economy will take care of me until it doesn't. And so I want to share with you what Andrew had to say. He said, Ray Dalio's famous principles come to mind when I reflect on Silicon Valley Bank's collapse. Having spent over a decade investing in volatile emerging markets that boom and bust 2 or 3 times more often than developed markets, I have my own principles when it comes to managing capital and beyond. The two most important are diversification and optionality. Asset classes, currencies, geographies, duration, liquidity. Unless you have a healthy mix in your portfolio, its vulnerability to black swans makes it much harder to produce long-term sustainable returns. And I think what you find in times like this is Andrew talking, is people figure, hey, I can't lose anymore. You saw during 2020 and 2021, the number only goes up in the Bitcoin and crypto space until it doesn't. You see economic numbers only go up until they don't. We have multi-decade lows for unemployment, not just the United States, but in other countries around the world. That'll last until it doesn't. Now, whenever bad things happen in the economy, especially in democracies, people get together and blame capitalism and point a finger at the greedy rich, and they want you to pay more taxes, they want your stuff to be taken, they want you to fund the bank bailouts so that they can get their money. Just look at Cyprus, for example. And so you want to be diversified across different geographies because black swan events are going to happen. Poo-poo is going to happen eventually. And you have to understand that the long-term sustainable returns that the Andrew who said this to me said, people think in times like these, well, as long, there's no way to lose. I just invest in things that only go up. I don't need to protect myself from the time when things go down. And whether we see that this year or in years to come, we are going to see a time when people once again are forced to remember that that is not the way things work. You can't just calculate that your business is going to go nowhere but up and that you're never going to make any mistakes and that nothing's ever bad's going to happen. You can't do that with your wealth either. You also, as we would say, shouldn't do that with your citizenship. Just because the United States has been the place to go, in your opinion, for a quarter of a century, doesn't mean it always will, doesn't mean they won't start cracking down. Look at what Canada's done, look at what the UK's done. Just because something has worked for a long time, that may give it some status, but it may not mean it's going to work forever. The same diversification principle, back to this Andrew, the same diversification principle is applicable to your financial infrastructure. His advice now, have at least 3 active bank accounts in different jurisdictions and at least 2 brokerage accounts. If you have 1 bank account, and you have any kind of money to speak of, even if you don't have any kind of money to speak of, quite frankly, if you have only 1 bank account, you're just asking for trouble. Who knows when that money could be frozen in different countries around the world? They get one John Smith confused with the other. I myself, years ago, paid my taxes in full to the state of California. One day I wake up, oh, there's no money there in my business account, or there was less money. Oh, you didn't pay your taxes, we just levied the money. Actually, I did. Here's the canceled check. Had to fight for months to get my money back. Governments make mistakes. People make mistakes. Banks can make mistakes. They could go out of business in the extreme case, as we are seeing in this instance. And people are always shocked. You want to have multiple accounts. Heck, in times like these, you want to have, especially in times like these, you want to have some kind of emergency fund. I taught our staff a very basic personal finance class, bare basic. And I said, hey, if you're going to have an emergency fund, which you need to have, keep that in a separate bank account Not at the same bank. Maybe you have two banks that are right next door to each other, but keep it in an account where you don't have a debit card and you've got to go there to access it, or you've got to go online to a separate interface and you've got to send the money that way so you're not tempted to use it. Even for basic personal finance, you want to have a couple different bank accounts, even just for personal reasons. But if you have any kind of wealth to speak of, Andrew's advice is, Andrew writing in, 3 active bank accounts in different jurisdictions. It's okay to have different banks in your country, but what happens when something happens in your country? What happens when a Cyprus-like event, a bail-in happens? What happens when the government cracks down? What happens when they want to take part of your wealth? What happens when the banks just all shut down? Now, you think that can't happen here? You probably didn't think you'd see the second largest bank failure in American history at a time when you're also hearing about record low unemployment, the lowest it's been since the Paleolithic era. Did you really think that that was going to be what happened? No, and guess what? It happened, as always, very slowly and then all at once, and you didn't have a lot of time to react. Andrew here continues. The diversification goes beyond the financial management. Try to have at least 2 citizenships, as you never know what kind of black swan is hiding behind the corner. Pandemic, war, tax hike, etc. It's not all financial, but that's part of it. It's hard to live a good life. It's hard to have options. It's hard to be diversified when you don't have any money, or you don't have access to it, or someone just took it. It could also be lifestyle, pandemic, different countries handle things differently. It could be wars. It's hard to avoid that in some cases. Who knows when you could be dragged into something? There's the constant saber rattling now, the US and China, what's going to happen next. So there's lots of black swan events that could happen, and they too will happen very slowly and then all at once. People have this tendency to think, especially in Western countries, because we work with clients from all around the world. We have a focus on Western countries, and we, I think, understand Western clients better than anybody else at Nomad Capitalist. And what we consistently see is, you know what, things won't be as bad. People who come from emerging economies, the way that this Andrew talks about, they understand the flaws in their system. What's amusing to me is that people in a country like the United States thinks there's no corruption there. Now they'll say there's corruption, but then somehow, they don't feel it'll ever impact them. They think that, their banks never fail. The reality is you probably have more corruption in your country than a lot of other emerging countries even. Your banks, if you're in the United States, fail more than every other country's banks combined. I mean, your country is not really immune from anything. You may be at an advantage. You may have a historical boost, but you never know what could happen next. And so good advice here from an ex-Goldman Sachs professional investor. Have 3 active bank accounts in different jurisdictions, 2 brokerage accounts, at least 2 passports. That's his principle of diversification. Now, let's talk about optionality. You want to have options, don't you? I don't care how wealthy you were. If you held a U.S. passport and a U.S. passport only during the pandemic, there was a time when your passport and its ability to get you into other countries was the same as Rwanda. Let that sink in for a minute. There was a time if you were an Australian where if you were out of your country, you weren't welcome. If you were in your country, you weren't allowed to leave. And that goes against everything that international law and even the United Nations has talked about for decades. They just said, you know what, to hell with it. It doesn't matter anymore. Exceptional circumstances. The government's always used exceptional circumstances as a reason to shut down your options, which is why you need diversification to fuel optionality. Here's what Andrew says about that. It's another important principle that he learned the hard way. I think a lot of us have seen that. Financial options always have value and don't come for free, right? So if you're going to go and set up a bank account, let's say you call Nomad Capitalist. We are a premium option for folks who want a suite of services that all work smoothly together. For people who realize just getting a passport in the Caribbean, that's helpful, but it's not really the end goal, right? We saw that there's a 900% increase in Americans getting St. Lucia citizenship. I would argue in part because yours truly, a former American, got St. Lucia citizenship, and people think, well, if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. Well, it's good enough for me because it's part of a holistic plan, and I have other citizenships, and it works in tandem with everything I'm doing. And so if you are looking for a plan to protect yourself with diversification and optionality in other countries, you can go to nomadcapitalist.com and you can learn how we can help you do this. You need to have some money. You need to have a certain income or a certain wealth for our services, but it is the most holistic out there. And yes, it's going to cost you. If you want diversification, you want to open a bank account in another country, it's going to be a bit more involved than going down the street and opening an account at Bank of America. But it's worth it. It's worth paying for. The best options don't come for free, as the gentleman says. He says it's correlated with the underlying asset volatility. There's more volatility in your country, there's more risk in your country, in many cases two different things, than you think. He says, but in the real life, many options are almost free. You can create an arbitrage. It doesn't cost you as much to open an additional bank account, or you can have, applying to a university, for example. So if you send your child to a university overseas, that may be cheaper than in the United States. Or he may say, eventually, you're going to arbitrage higher interest rates in other countries, right? So people in the U.S. are putting their money in treasuries, saying that the government is safer than banks. Okay, maybe that's true. I'd rather put my money in safer banks in other countries and remove the geographical risk. And guess what? You can earn more money in more developed, less corrupt countries with statistically safer banks. Let's say in Singapore, you can earn higher interest rates there in just a regular bank account, oftentimes insured. You can also diversify in other currencies and earn higher interest rates. So what he's saying is, over time, the arbitrage opportunities could pay off. Send your kids to school in Europe rather than the United States. It's going to be cheaper, and you bought yourself diversification. You bought them an opportunity. Put your money in a foreign bank account. Eventually, the costs could come back to benefit you because you invest in a currency that went up. We've talked about the Armenian dram, the Georgian lari. Both saw huge gains against the US dollar in 2022. Some of the only currencies that did that, on top of they paid you 11%. Even if you just put your money in US dollars in many foreign banks, you could earn a little bit higher interest than you would in the United States. So over time it pays for itself, but it does have a cost up front. And so, two important principles, diversification and optionality. How are you using those? Let me be clear. Having two citizenships is better than having one in almost every case. Okay, if you're Iranian or Syrian or you're North Korean, okay, it's probably, even these days, Russian can be a disadvantage in many cases. But generally speaking, two citizenships are better than one. So if you are, if you've gone out, we now help people exclusively with citizenship by descent. And so if you've got an Italian, an Irish, a Slovak, a Trinidad and Tobago ancestor, you can potentially get citizenship. That's going to put you ahead of the curve. That's going to give you more options. That's going to give you diversification. But if you don't know how to use that, if you don't know what that all gets you, if you don't know what the pitfalls of that are, and make sure you stay out of trouble, then it's not going to be as useful to you just by doing random acts and collecting random shiny objects. You want to have proper diversification and optionality, and let this be your moment. Joe Biden wants to raise your taxes. Politicians around the world want to raise your taxes. You've seen how they've treated you in the last couple of years. You've seen that they do view you as their property. And now you're seeing an example of how your money isn't safe if you put it in the wrong bank, if you put it in the wrong place. This is a wake-up call for diversification and optionality. We've helped well over 1,000 folks do it. We've inspired hundreds of thousands of folks around the world to do it. Diversification, optionality. Don't just do things in a vacuum. Do a holistic set of steps that each get you there. One bank account, one passport, that's good. Having a whole suite of services that make you better protected, more diversified, and put you back in the driver's seat when that's increasingly out of vogue is what will make you win.